who's kind of sacrificed his own safety and in many ways his own life to fight for things that he believes in. And I think he is absolutely amazing. So I'm really, really excited. I hope you're going to have loads and loads of questions. Those of you who do general studies, at the end, you need to sign the piece of paper on the red table there so that we know that you've attended. So over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I was asked to speak on the theme of what next for LGBTI rights in Britain. So we're going to talk a bit about where we've come from, what we've achieved, and what still needs to be done to secure equality and human rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people. LGBTI for short. As you all know, we have achieved some astonishing, phenomenal positive changes, mostly in the last decade or so. We must never forget that until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world. Some of those laws dated back decades, some dated back centuries. So many of you may think that homosexuality was legalized or at least decriminalized in 1967. Not true. The reform of that year, first of all, it only applied to England and Wales. It was not extended to Scotland until 1980 and not to Northern Ireland until 1982. And secondly, the anti-gay laws were not repealed, they were just merely not enforced in certain narrow, limited circumstances. So all the anti-gay laws remained on the statute books from 1967 right through until 2003. And they're in the statute books under the heading of, quote, unnatural offences. You've all heard of Oscar Wilde. You know he was sent to prison for 2 years hard labour in 1895 for having sex with men. That law was only repealed in 2003. The law against anal sex, which was passed in 1533 during the King Henry VIII's reign, was only repealed 11 years ago. So you get my drift that the ending of criminalization is relatively recent. But it has ended, and it's been the result of a long, long campaign lasting over 40 years. For 40 years, there was a campaign to get rid of these laws. For the first 30 or more of those years, there was no change, or just one or two minor changes. But now we're in a place where sexual offences law does not discriminate between heterosexual and homosexual behaviour. Also, of course, many other laws have changed. The ban on gay people serving in the armed forces has been lifted. The ban on local authorities, so-called promoting homosexuality, under Section 28, has been repealed. We now have the right of same-sex couples to foster and adopt children, which until about a decade ago was illegal. We now have laws in place to protect lesbian and gay people against discrimination in the workplace and in the provision of goods and services. But again, until the last decade or so, it was lawful by default for an employer to refuse to hire someone because they were LGBTI, and it was lawful for them to sack someone because they were LGBTI. Equally, a landlord could lawfully refuse to rent premises to a gay person. Or if they had a gay tenant and discovered they were gay, they could lawfully evict them, because there was no protection against discrimination. Employment protection only kicked in 2003, 2004. Protection against discrimination in the provision of goods and services, including housing, advertising, and so on, only kicked in 2007, 2008. You'll also be aware that in 2005, the first same-sex civil partnerships became possible, and then this year, the first same-sex marriages. Now, same-sex marriage is the last big legal discrimination to be overturned. But the ban on same-sex marriage only existed for 43 years. Under the 1949 Marriage Act, which is the main marriage law in this country, there never was a ban on same-sex marriage. The law simply said two people have a right to marry. It didn't specify they have to be male and female. So the ban on same-sex marriage was only legislated in 1971 to stop gay people, and in particular transgender people, from marrying the person they love. So the new legislation, the 2013 Same-Sex Marriage Act, repealed that prohibition but created a whole new legal framework. So we now have two separate marriage laws. We've got the old long-standing 1949 Marriage Act, which is for different sex couples only, for men and women. And then we've got the 2013 Marriage Act, which is for same-sex couples only. We have segregation in marriage law. One law for straights, another one for gays. Separate is not equal. Separate is not equal. That's discrimination. And you know that although same-sex couples can still have a civil partnership, straight couples can't. Straight couples are still banned from having a civil partnership. Because when the law was introduced in 2004, 2005, the government made a point of saying that civil partnerships were for same-sex couples only, and that different sex couples were banned. And that ban still remains in place today. And in my view, banning straight couples from having a civil partnership is just as bad as banning gay couples from having a civil marriage. So that's unfinished business. There's also discrimination in the new marriage law when it comes to pension inheritance if your partner dies. If you're a straight couple and you're married under the 1949 Marriage Act, if your deceased partner had been paying into his or her pension pot, say since 1960, you'll be able to claim as the surviving spouse all those pension contributions going back to 1960. But if you're in a same-sex marriage, in the same situation, you can't claim back to 1960. You can only by law claim back to either 2005 or 1988 at the most. So if your deceased partner had been paying their pension pot since 1960, you would lose 40 plus years of pension contributions. That's a huge financial loss for the survivor in a same-sex marriage where one partner dies. That quite clearly is discrimination. But leaving same-sex marriage aside, what else is not right? Well, we have, as you know, many fantastic equality laws. In particular, the 2010 Equality Act, which brought together all the different equality laws into a single unified framework. A fantastic piece of legislation. In fact, an idea that I proposed way back in 1979 as a young Labour Party activist. It was rejected by the Labour Party not only in 1979, but in the 1980s and the 1990s. But eventually, a few years ago, Labour agreed to it, and it was finally legislated. But even that law and all the other laws have written into them qualified exemptions for religious organizations. They are allowed by law to discriminate against LGBTI people. We're not just talking about places of worship like churches, mosques, temples, or synagogues. It also applies to faith-run schools, hospitals, nursing homes, and shelters for the homeless. They are allowed by law to refuse to employ someone or to refuse to supply a service to someone on the grounds they're LGBTI if they can show that it's against their religious ethos. If they can show that it's contrary to their religious values to provide this service or to employ this person, they have a right to discriminate. They're the only group in society that's allowed to discriminate in that way. Nobody else has those exemptions. Now, I will defend the right of people of faith to be protected against discrimination. It's a pity many of them won't defend the right of gay people to be protected against discrimination. What they want is the right in the name of religion to continue to discriminate against LGBTI people. And I think that's wrong. Because to me, in a democratic society, we should all be equal before the law. There should be no exemptions, no special clauses for particular groups. Everybody should be equal before the law. The prohibition against discrimination should apply to everyone. People of faith have a right to believe that homosexuality is wrong. I'm disappointed that they interpret their scriptures in that way, but they've got a right. I'll defend their right. But they don't have a right to discriminate. So that's another issue. So, moving on, what about hate crime? Even today in Britain, 1/3 of all LGBTI people have been victims at least once, and sometimes several times, of homophobic hate crimes, including actual physical violence. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. You may have heard of the case in London earlier this year of a group of gay men leaving a nightclub and being set upon by a gang and beaten up. You may have heard of the case of Ian Bainham, an elderly gay man who was kicked to death in Trafalgar Square in 2009. And when it comes to schools, we see the same issue. Perhaps not at this school, but we know from evidence that we have that over 50% of all young LGBTI people say they suffered homophobic or transphobic bullying at their school, ranging from teasing and name-calling to threats and even to actual physical assaults in the classroom and the playground. Over 50%. Yet at the same time, nearly half of all schools still don't have an anti-bullying program that specifically addresses homophobic and transphobic bullying. And the worst offenders are faith schools. Faith schools often have the highest rates of homophobic and transphobic bullying and do the least to counteract it. So a big problem there. We also know that although we have laws that ostensibly protect gay people against violence and threats, they're often not enforced. So some of you may be familiar with the Jamaican reggae and dancehall singers like Buju Banton, Bounty Killer, Elephant Man, and so on. They've all put out tracks that openly encourage the killing of LGBTI people. They aren't just homophobic, they glorify, encourage, and extol the murder of LGBTI people. They variously suggest go out and shoot a person, pour acid on them, burn them alive. This is in their lyrics. These are criminal acts because incitement to murder is a very serious criminal offence. Yet not one of these singers has ever been prosecuted, either here, in Jamaica, the United States, or any other country where such exhortations to murder are serious crimes. If they'd been white and advocated killing black people or Jews, we all know they would have been arrested, put on trial and jailed. So my question is, why the double standards? Why is it that when these singers say kill gay people, they're allowed to get away with it? Can you believe it? The BBC, a publicly funded broadcaster, used to play these songs and promote these artists until only a few years ago, when after a nearly 10-year campaign, they finally agreed to stop. They were the BBC was colluding with what we called murder music. Again, incredible double standards. If this was music was saying kill Jews or Muslims or black people or Asian people, they would have never ever been allowed to be played on the BBC. So you can see the real double standard. And you know, it's just been repeated in a lesser degree only in the last few days. A BBC radio station gave a platform to an extremist homophobe to denounce same-sex civil partnerships and to make inflammatory, unfactual claims about gay people. The BBC does not give platforms to overt racists, to overt anti-Semites. It doesn't give them platforms. Why then was this particular Christian extremist given a platform to spout such hatred? It doesn't seem fair, it doesn't seem right. The other issue I want to raise is the treatment of LGBTI asylum seekers. That is, people who've fled homophobic and transphobic persecution in countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Jamaica, Uganda, and so on. Now, we all know that all refugees get a raw deal. Contrary to what the Daily Mail claims, the asylum system is rigged to fail as many refugees as possible. Because the government's priority, dancing to the tune of UKIP and the Daily Mail, is to stop as many refugees claiming asylum as possible. So it's rigged the system to fail as many refugees as possible. And it does this in a number of ways. First of all, it's cut legal aid. If you're a refugee and you arrive here destitute, you haven't got the funds to employ a solicitor. So you're dependent upon legal aid. Legal aid is now being cut to such a huge degree that no solicitor can prepare a proper asylum claim. On the money available, you can't get the witness statements, the medical evidence, the police records. It's impossible. And it's designed that way to fail as many refugees as possible. The other trick they use is putting refugees on what they call fast track. Under fast track, a refugee will be put in an asylum detention center, which is basically a prison by another name. So these people have perhaps escaped the prison in some tyrannical regime, and we go and put them in a prison type situation. And then under the fast track system, they have about 2 weeks to prepare an asylum claim and to make an appeal. Well, that is just physically impossible. First of all, when you're in detention, how can you possibly get the evidence you need to substantiate your claim? You haven't got the freedom to make phone calls and all those kind of things. You may be able to be given the use of a mobile phone or a computer, but you haven't got the freedom to prepare the documentation and evidence you need. And then on top of that, when you're in detention, there are severe restrictions on consultations with your solicitor. So even liaising with your solicitor is difficult. So these are all ways in which the asylum system is rigged, deliberately rigged by the government to make sure that most genuine refugees fail. And that is absolutely morally wrong. To rig the system to fail people without care for the individual merits is morally and ethically wrong. Now that applies to all refugees, but it's particularly bad for LGBTI refugees. Compared to all refugees, LGBTI refugees have an even higher rate of refusal. There's a culture of disbelief. If you're a macho man and you're gay, they will say to you, "You don't look gay to me." If you're a pretty, feminine, petite lesbian, they'll say, "You don't look lesbian to me." If you've been married and you've got kids, they will say, "You can't be gay," ignoring the fact that in so many cultures in Asia, Africa and the Middle East, the family and social pressures often force LGBTI people to marry and to have kids. Not they don't choose to do it, they feel compelled by family and community and religious pressure. Increasingly, what the government does is say, "We don't believe you're gay." This is when people produce photographs of them with their partners, love letters, shared accounts, even a civil partnership. They'll say it's all concocted to deliberately fool us. You've made all this up to pretend that you're gay. And then we turn around to the government and say, well, how do people prove that they're gay or lesbian, bisexual or transgender? How do they do it? If you reject all this evidence, what do they have to do to prove they're gay? And the government refuses to give an answer. So it's a catch-22. When it comes to sex and relationship education in schools, I don't know what the situation is in this school, but I do know that in most schools it doesn't address or adequately address the welfare and needs of LGBTI pupils. I mean, overall, the research we've had shows that most young people say that sex and relationship education is rubbish, full stop. It's about biology, not about emotions, not about feelings, not about relationships. It doesn't talk about consent, it doesn't talk about abuse. It ignores most of the important issues. But for LGBTI people, it's even worse. Some schools do include LGBTI people, but most do not. And even most of those that do include it only include it in passing. The same with HIV education. It's primarily focused in most schools on heterosexual sex. It doesn't explain and specifically address same-sex issues. And that is particularly regrettable given that so many young gay and bisexual men are becoming infected with HIV. And when you ask them, they nearly all say, we didn't have anything about gay sex and relationships in sex education. We didn't have anything about gay sex and relationships in HIV education. There's now a campaign to make sex and relationship education comprehensive, to include issues like consent and abuse, so people understand those issues really clearly and are empowered to say no to unwanted sexual attention, to ensure that all young people, whatever their sexuality or gender identity, know about safer sex and about the different kinds of safer sex, how you can have sexual pleasure without penetration, and what to do, for example, if your partner refuses to wear a condom. What do you do? It's a question that most schools don't answer. They don't even ask it. They don't even ask it. Yet it's a real life problem for lots of young people. So there's a campaign to make sex and relationship education compulsory in every school, because it's not compulsory now, and to also require legally to include sex and relationship education addressing LGBTI issues. That's a campaign that's going on right now against the current failures and inadequacies. There's also, at the same time, a big campaign to give education, particularly targeted at young men, boys and young men, around consent. Sex is lawful if your partner consents. But what is consent? What do you do if you're being pestered for sex by someone, whether they're the same age or older? What do you do? How do you deal with that? These are issues that most schools do not address for any kids, gay or straight. So you can see that there's quite a lot of extra work to be done. We've made great progress, as I said, but more needs to be done. And that's the challenge in the years ahead, how to build on our past success to complete these other issues that still remain to be resolved. Thank you. So we're going to open it up to questions and answers now. So, all contributions, if you've got anything you'd like to say, hands up.
You stated that
you have to stand up and shout really loud.
Brilliant. You said that the BBC doesn't give platforms to racists or anti-Semites, quote unquote. Yet Nick Griffin made a somewhat infamous appearance on BBC Question Time in the past. So I'd strongly question that statement. Also, and this is just what I've heard, the European Court of Human Rights gave a ruling recently, but the immigration system has to accept asylum seekers at their word, and they claim they are gay or homosexual or transgender. So is that part of your speech still relevant anymore? Thank you.
On the first point, I think what I was specifically addressing is the way in which the BBC was giving a platform to singers who were singing these songs which encouraged violence and murder. Nick Griffin, when he appeared on Question Time and in the years previously, had never, as far as I know, actually encouraged violence or murder. So I think there is a difference there. On the second point, you're right, the European Court of Justice has made that ruling, but it's one thing to have a ruling, it's another thing to have it implemented. So for example, until 2010, the tactic of the government was to often grudgingly acknowledge that a person had suffered homophobic or transphobic persecution, but then say to them that they could go back to their home country and behave with discretion, which meant things like go back to your home country, change your name, move to a part of the country where no one knows you, and stop having same-sex relationships. Then no one will know you're gay and you won't be persecuted. Now that was ruled illegal by the High Court in 2010. So the government shifted its tactic. So now the new tactic is, we don't believe you're gay. Now that ought to be now unlawful according to that European Court of Justice ruling. It basically said you can't ask intrusive questions, but you know it should actually narrow the parameters. But the reality is, we know that the government is so obsessed with cutting asylum numbers, they will almost certainly find a new way to deny LGBTI people asylum. They've been consistently changing the goalposts. So I don't think we can yet say that that problem is resolved. It's good they can't ask those questions anymore, providing the government accepts it, and the government has indicated it will accept it, but we haven't actually seen that in the reality of the way in which asylum cases are treated. So we must wait to see whether they do accept it, and whether or not they then further try and shift the goalposts by introducing some new hurdle. Other questions?
What if someone is lying about being gay? What if they are seeking our refuge to come to this country? How are we supposed to stop the barrier of immigrants coming into our country if people are then allowed to just say that they're gay? How do you suggest that's managed?
Well, of course, people have to provide evidence. You know, just because someone claims they're gay doesn't mean they've got an automatic right to stay here. No one's saying that. But when you produce joint bank accounts or love letters or email or text messages, when you produce photographs together, when family members or friends testify that you're gay, when you've got a record of being involved in a gay rights organisation, the cumulative effect of all that evidence ought to be sufficient to ensure that someone can be recognised as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender or intersex. I've got to say that in the hundreds of LGBTI refugees that I've helped over the last 20 years, there are only two out of probably 500 where I've got some doubt about whether they were genuine. Now that's a pretty low rate. So I think we have to err on the side of caution and give people asylum where they can produce some documentary evidence and so on.
What have you done?
Shout.
Sorry, what have you done concerning LGBT that you've been most proud of?
What have I done that I've been most proud of? Well, it's very hard to identify any one thing, but I would say that the campaign against police harassment is a campaign I'm particularly proud of. Up until actually about 10 years ago, there was widespread police harassment of the LGBTI community. We were being victimized in a way that straight people never were. So for example, two women or two men kissing each other goodbye or holding hands at a bus stop could get arrested until about 15 years ago. But no straight couple, no boy-girl doing that would ever get arrested. So double standards. The age of consent was unequal until 2001. Until 1994, it was 21 for two men, but 16 for a man and a woman, or two women. So that was quite clearly discrimination. Sex involving more than two men was unlawful until 2003. So there's lots of different ways in which the law discriminated. So the upshot was that in 1989, the number of men convicted of consenting homosexual offences was almost as great as in 1954-55, in a period when male homosexuality was totally illegal and when the country was gripped by a McCarthyite-style anti-gay witch hunt. In that year, over 2,000 men were convicted of the Oscar Wilde offence of so-called, quote, gross indecency. In other words, just sex between men. Over 2,000. Almost as many as in 1954-55. And under other anti-gay laws, probably another 1,000 or more were also convicted. At the same time, that same period, the rate of queer-bashing violence had escalated. I and colleagues identified between 1986 and 1991 at least 51 men murdered in circumstances that pointed to a homophobic motive. And wave after wave of queer-bashing attacks in shopping centres, in the street outside people's homes, kids being beaten up on the way home from school, you name it. The police were doing almost nothing about this scale of homophobic violence and murder. They basically ignored it. With a few honourable exceptions, we were treated like criminals. There were no proper police investigations. It was perfunctory. Yet the police were putting huge resources into arresting gay and bisexual men for behaviour which was not a crime between heterosexuals, when everyone had consented and no one was harmed. So in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we went to New Scotland Yard and we tried to negotiate with the police to stop this sustained campaign of harassment. The police smiled, they gave us tea and sandwiches, they listened, then they went away and ordered more raids and more arrests. So after this happening for a number of months, we just thought, this is a PR exercise by the police. They're trying to make themselves look good by saying, we are talking with the gay community. But in reality, the talks produce no change. So we walked out, and I say we, those of us representing the LGBTI direct action human rights group, Outrage, we walked out and began a very high profile campaign of harassment back. We turned the tables and began harassing the police. So we interrupted the press conferences of the then Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Paul Condon. We invaded and occupied police stations that were harassing and victimising the gay community. We secretly photographed undercover police officers. What the police used to do is, they'd select a young handsome officer, they'd dress him up in a t-shirt, tight white jeans, black boots, black leather jacket, and they'd send him into a public toilet or a park or into the street where, and they'd get him to play with his willy, and any man who responded would get arrested. So the police were actually encouraging the commission of criminal acts. So what we did was, first of all, we were informed where these were by people who had been victimised. So we put out warnings through the gay press. We put out warnings in the area. We'd make posters and fly post them on lampposts or street billboards or in public toilets or on park notice boards, warning people that the police were operating in this area. And then sometimes we managed to secretly photograph these undercover operators, and we put their photographs on the posters, warning this man is a secret police agent who entraps gay men. We only had to do this for about 3 or 4 months before the police were pleading with us to come back to negotiate, because they were so embarrassed. We'd made them look like homophobic bigots, which is what they were, and we'd turned public opinion against them, because we'd argued with local community groups and the public. We said, look, why are police wasting resources on targeting gay and bisexual men who are consenting, who've harmed no one, where no one apart from the police is complaining, yet at the same time there's this wave of homophobic murders which they're not addressing. Plus there are street robberies, domestic violence, assaults on women, racist attacks. The police claim they can't deal with them. They haven't got enough officers, haven't got enough resources. Yet they had resources to target the gay community. So very quickly we won the battle of public opinion, which is why the police pleaded with us to resume negotiations, which we did. But we didn't just go back there. We went back to the negotiations armed with a series of proposals about how the community could be policed in a non-homophobic way. So we asked for things like the appointment of a liaison officer, a police liaison officer, senior officer, to liaise with the LGBTI community, to establish a conduit. We argued that instead of arresting people, the police should put out warning notices, like we'd done on trees or lampposts. Put out warning messages through the gay press, and that they didn't have to arrest someone for an offence. They could give them a caution or merely a warning, and that would probably be sufficient. So the police were quite surprised because they thought we were just a protest group. But when we came back with practical proposals, they were stumped, because they knew our proposals were sensible, workable, practical. And so in the end, they felt obliged to implement them. So within the first year, they had reluctantly implemented 3/4 of our proposals for a non-homophobic policing policy. 3/4. Not all, but 3/4. That's a big achievement in 1 year. Within 3 years, the number of gay and bisexual men convicted for these offences fell by 2/3. The biggest, fastest fall ever recorded. And that literally saved thousands of gay and bisexual men from arrest and criminal conviction. Plus it also probably saved their jobs and their marriages, because many of these men were married men. So that, I think, is one of the most, the campaigns I'm most proud of, because it had real, tangible, practical, positive results. Anywhere up the back?
Why do you want to bring the age of consent down to 14?
For many, many years, about 30 years, I've argued that while young people should be protected against exploitation, whether by young people their own age or by those older, I don't support the criminalisation of young people of similar ages who have consenting sex. Now, in my own view, it's probably best if young people wait. It's not a good idea to have sex at an early age. But if you do, I don't think you should be treated as a criminal. And I don't think you should be put on the sex offenders register. Under the 2003 Sexual Offences Act, for the first time in British law, sexual relations between two people of similar ages under the age of consent has become a specific criminal offence. And it's not just full sex, it's any kind of sexual contact. Even mere kissing and touching between two 15-year-olds or a 14-year-old and a 13-year-old, that now becomes a serious criminal offence, punishable by up to 5 years imprisonment in a young offenders institution and placement on the sex offenders register together with rapists and paedophiles. Now, I think that's wrong. If the two people have consented, if they've not complained, if they've not been harmed, they should not be treated as criminals. So I chose 14 because that is now the average age of first sexual experience. So the average age at which young people can be prosecuted under this law. I have, however, suggested that maybe we should keep the age of consent at 16, but have a policy of not prosecuting sex involving young people under 16, providing there's no more than 2 or 3 years difference in their ages, which is a system they have in Germany, Israel, Switzerland, and a few other countries. So in other words, two people of similar ages would not be prosecuted, but if it was, say, a 14-year-old and a 50-year-old, that would still be a crime. So that's the thinking. But I said even then, I would only agree to it if it went hand in hand with earlier, better quality sex education in schools. The idea is that we want to give young people the knowledge, the skills, the confidence to make wise, responsible sexual choices, including saying no to sex, because that's a legitimate option as well. Also, of course, I said that this education needs to include education in issues of consent. When does someone consent? What do they have to do to consent? Just because they don't say no doesn't mean they've consented. There also needs to be education about abuse issues. To tell people to simply phone Childline, that's not good enough. We need to educate young people about what is abuse, and that abuse cannot just be from older men or women, it can also be from somebody your own age or even younger. There are lots of instances of young people bullying and pressuring other young people into having sex they don't want. And that is a form of abuse as well. So I've said these changes only happen if all those things are in place. And one of the things I've also said was that education should include assertiveness training, so that young people feel confident to say no to sex they don't want, they don't feel pressured to give in to sex, and also confident to report abusers. And so I think all these issues taken together are about protection of young people. The age of consent itself is not a protection. Paedophiles and others ignore the age of consent. It's meaningless. It doesn't stop them. What does stop them is young people who are confident to say no and to then go and report the abusers to the police. That's the way to stop child sex abuse. If you raise the age of consent to 25, it wouldn't stop abuse, because abusers ignore the law.
Do you not think that it would be discrimination against the church to force them into accepting homosexuality when it's against their core beliefs, and almost that's double standards, allowing one minority to have say over another minority?
Well, the right to discriminate is not a human right. And that's what the church wants. It wants the right to discriminate. It wouldn't like it if Christians were discriminated against. And nor would I. I would oppose any law that said you can discriminate against a Christian, or a Jew, or a Muslim, or a Hindu, or a Sikh, or a Buddhist. I would oppose that. People are entitled to their own beliefs, but they're not entitled to say that because of my faith, everybody in the country must do as I say. My mother is a devout evangelical Christian. She still, bless her, believes that homosexuality is wrong, because it says so in the Bible. And she believes the Bible is the literal word of God. However, she's also got enough sense to realize that in terms of sins, it's not a major sin. It's a very minor sin. If two consenting adults are having particularly a loving consenting relationship, that is not a major sin. Racism is a major sin. War is a major sin. Greed or theft or murder are major sins. Rape is a major sin. Child sex abuse is a major sin. Homosexuality is a very minor sin. But she also says, God gives everyone a choice. There is no compulsion in religion. God doesn't force you to believe in God and to follow his laws. It's your choice. And therefore, to seek to impose on anybody God's law would be wrong, because God gives us choice. Indeed, Islam, one of the major tenets of Islam is there is no compulsion in religion. So my mother makes a distinction between her personal private belief and what she thinks the law of the land should say. She says the law of the land should be neutral in matters of faith and religion, but she hopes that everyone will be a Christian. But she doesn't want to impose her understanding of Christianity on everyone else. She thinks that's a matter of individual choice.
Just quickly, over past generations there's been almost a lack of understanding in some cases between straight individuals and those of the LGBTI community. Do you think that more depth in those topics of sex ed would help bridge the gap of understanding and help people to more tolerate the LGBTI community and understand what they stand for, to just giving them a label or discriminating against them?
Well, I think it's undoubtedly a fact that no child is born bigoted. Children are not born with homophobia, racism, misogyny, or any other kind of prejudice. That's something they learn because of the bad negative influences of other young people around them